What's going on, everyone? I don't usually make videos about like movies and whatnot, but I kind of just wanted to talk about this mainly from a standpoint of I love Injustice, absolutely love Injustice, and unfortunately, I feel like the movie really just didn't do it didn't do the comic any justice, and pun intended. The thing about Injustice the movie is like it just felt like one of the worst DC movies, like animatedly speaking, right? And to this day, like I highly stand by the statement that DC like animated movies on the Justice League and things like that, they're freaking amazing. Like I highly suggest that you go and watch them and whatnot, right? But Injustice honestly feels like one of the weaker films, and DC makes a lot of animated films that are just again great. So for Injustice, a story that most people consider one of the best stories written in comics, one of the weaker films, and that's the film adaptation, that just shows you that they did a few things wrong. And I feel like one of the biggest things that they did wrong is they neglected the philosophies and ideologies that they were trying to showcase in the actual comic itself. You see, Batman and Superman, that war between them, right? That wasn't really the main purpose of Injustice. They were just the vessels being used by the writers to talk about, like, the philosophy of freedom versus, controlled freedom, because that's basically what it was. Superman's freedom was still controlled freedom, whereas Batman was fighting for freedom in the sense of like absolute freedom. Now, the problem with that is Batman is basically saying that people should be absolutely free to do whatever they want, even if that includes like decisions that are unfortunately going to affect other people in a certain way. Whereas Superman was basically saying, no, I'm sick of this, and if you need to have your freedom taken from you and get replaced with a controlled version of freedom, then so be it. If that means that you're not necessarily going to be as self-destructive as you currently were. And it's really interesting to have these two people talk about this because, on one hand, it was a complete 180. You see, Batman as himself is someone that wants to stop people from, using their freedom to harm other people. Batman's whole motivation is intimidating criminals to stop committing crime. Superman is just there as the Blue Boy Scout, and he basically is just there to say, hey, be free, be true to whatever it is that you're going to try and do so long as you don't hurt people. So it was a complete 180, and that's what made it so interesting is that the Dark Knight was basically being the Boy Scout for once, and the Boy Scout was being the Dark Knight. And you see this, like, there are comic panels where, like, as soon as the villain sees Superman, he just steps in there like freaking Darkseid, right? With his hands behind his back. They just like, oh, we surrender. And he just looks at him, he's like, don't even think about running. Wouldn't dream of it. And, that's the really important thing, because, like, that was basically how criminals view Batman sometimes. The moment that Batman was there, he's just, like, right behind him. Oh, I stop. They just stop, they just throw the guns up and just surrender. It would be hilarious to, like, witness that, until it was really funny to see that happening in the comics and whatnot. But again, like, it goes back to like the saying of, should you have freedom if you use freedom to like negatively impact other people? Realistically speaking, if that's the case, then why should Batman, like, really be complaining in the sense that, hey, criminals are just using their freedom to, negatively impact other people? If you're fighting so hard for the fact that they should have the freedom to do what they want and whatnot, then you have to accept that, yeah, they're gonna have criminals. You're gonna have people that are gonna like, kill someone's parents. You're gonna have people that are gonna, sexually assault people and whatnot. That's just a part of the freedom. And some people do say that. You do have some people that talk about injustice, and that's the amazing thing about this comic, that so many different kinds of people, we're talking about this and talking about the kind of like, ideological standpoints on this. Well, that's just the price of freedom. And then you have some people say, well, then screw that. I don't care if that's the price of freedom. You don't deserve to have the right to negatively use your freedom to affect someone else's freedom. And that's the kind of point that I stand on, because I am not 100% Team Superman, but I'm sure as heck not, Team Batman, because realistically speaking, Batman in this, when you really take the time to look at it, is a hypocrite. His whole motivation, again, for being Batman is to use fear to manipulate criminals to stop committing crime. So he wants to take, technically speaking here, take away a freedom aspect indirectly. He's not necessarily directly doing it, he's indirectly doing it by using fear, which is something that, Sinestro is all about, which is a shame that we didn't necessarily see him as much as I would have liked in the comics. Like, we saw him, like, for what I think it was Injustice Year 2, and then that was basically, like, it for most of the comics. So I really did miss that about Sinestro, because that's the whole thing about Sinestro's core. The reason why Sinestro went to form his own core is like, hey, listen, like, fear is going to make that person stop. When you just put them in the jail cell and whatnot, and then they just serve their time, air quotes, or if they have certain kinds of privileges and they have connections, and they just get out and they just do it again. Fear, when they're actually afraid of you, okay, I'm not going to try that. Like, I know what's going to happen if I do that, and I'm not going to do that anymore. So the thing about like the Yellow Lanterns being involved in the story, it was really fitting to have Superman like become Yellow Lantern. But I know that they basically took that away, mainly from a standpoint of saying like he'd just be freaking broken, a freaking Kryptonian with a lantern ring of any kind, really just blows out of the proportions like the levels of power, considering that they're already freaking OP. But seriously, the movie just really didn't talk about that as much. It really didn't, and that was really sad. We had these moments where like Barry Allen and Hal Jordan like straight up went to the government when the government was saying, "Oh, we're going to just we're going to just stop operating because we don't like that you're controlling us and whatnot," right? And Hal basically says, "You guys do this all the time." Oh, they were talking about like being democratically elected, and he's like, "You guys do this all the time. You don't even realize just how corrupt you are." And like you had these kinds of moments with people like Catwoman, because some people might consider like Catwoman like, well, that's ridiculous, she's just a criminal. And again, I do understand that there are certain complex situations that involve like is someone like Catwoman, for example, who is deemed a criminal and whatnot, you know is she a criminal when she takes from stuff, when she takes like like money and valuables like from the rich in Gotham that are usually they're operating crime syndicates and whatnot, even though they're not necessarily the direct ones doing it, they still are directly funding those things and getting money back. And when she takes that from them and she helps the people who are like just trying to just get by, one does beg the question like is she really doing something wrong? And that's the really important thing, is that people have always said like when the government or whoever is in power is consistently abusing authority, it becomes your duty to disobey them and whatnot. And that's the kind of thing that we talk about in Injustice. It's that you have all these kinds of you have all these countries that have their beliefs, and they have what they stand for, and at the end of the day they're still using that, a few people in each country who are dictating to others what they can and can't do, even if they're not necessarily 100% called a dictator by name. They're still dictating to what people what they should and shouldn't do. That ends up creating like blood feuds spanning entire generations, and people who are fighting there don't even know why they're fighting. They're just, that's all that they know. And unfortunately, as a result, you get the world that Superman was listened to, because you got to think about it in that aspect. The guy's just lost his wife and child. And people don't realize this, but like that super hearing never freaking goes away. He hears that all the time. Like being a Kryptonian low key would probably be freaking insane. Not just for the reasons that people think about, like the fun reasons, but just the bad reasons, like just constantly hearing, like people like screaming for help and whatnot, like wars, sexual assaults, all kinds of things like that, right? He hears that constantly, and just after losing the city and losing the love of his life, he just says, enough's enough. And again, it's really interesting to have someone again like Batman of all people who would know, like enough's enough in that. And he usually, because Batman's usually his whole motivation is like no more, just no more. Even though like he directly keeps, unfortunately, criminals around. Because even if you technically said that, well, he doesn't necessarily have to kill him like Joker. Like you gotta think about this. Like Batman has a contingency plan for like virtually everyone in the Justice League to sometimes keep them like held indefinitely if he has to. And you're telling me he couldn't keep like for example, like Joker, like somewhere like super secure? Like why keep bringing him to the place that he's breaking out of? Like there's plenty of places where they could technically like be putting people who are like absolutely freaking ridiculous in DC. Now, of course, technically speaking, we're not necessarily going to have that, considering that that would make characters that we know and love like basically just gone, and no one really wants that 100%. But again, these are just being used to talk about real world issues, and it's really interesting, and that's why I highly recommend you look at Injustice. And the movie again, it just really didn't do that good enough, because for me personally, I feel like the best characters like in this of all were people like Aquaman, were people like Black Adam and whatnot, and people like Damian Wayne. Because at the end of the day, these were characters that usually were like, at least Aquaman, Black Adam's like, hey, listen, I'm gonna stay to my country and whatnot. I'm gonna stay to my people, and I look out for them. Because like these kinds of characters look at the rest of the world, and they just really just don't necessarily laugh. They just look at it and like, why the heck are you constantly screwing up things for yourself and whatnot? Why are you being so freaking ridiculous? These are the characters that just mind their kingdoms, and you see it. Their kingdoms, yes, they do have their squabbles here and there and whatnot, but for the most part, they're nowhere near as chaotic as the rest of the world is in DC Comics and whatnot. And then you have someone like Damian Wayne, and this is the really interesting point where he's constantly just like looking at like who's really right here. But at the end of the day, he ends up choosing Superman mainly because he's like, hey, listen, at the end of the day, even me being raised as an assassin and whatnot, and I saw the world black and white a lot. As I grew older, I realized that it wasn't. But at the end of the day, regardless of if someone's freedoms have to be, mitigated somewhat to some extent, if it makes the world better, then I'm going to accept that. And so that was the really interesting aspect because, unfortunately, like that's how it works. Like people assume that you can have absolute freedom and then somehow like have absolute peace. There is always going to be someone out there that is just the douchebag that uses their freedom to screw over other people. You can always just say, well, you shouldn't do that, but that doesn't stop them. Usually, unfortunately, human nature says, hey, you don't do this, and that makes people want to do it more. And so Injustice said, all right, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to freaking rip you apart. And that's what really says, okay, no. But again, like the main point was if you force peace, then the moment that the gun drops that you're holding peace by, then so be it. But again, in Superman's case, the guy's freaking virtually immortal and is going to literally outlive the entire human race. So like good luck trying to good luck trying to usurp that. Especially that was the most funny thing about it. But unfortunately, even in other comics like Doctor Doom, like Doctor Doom is my favorite comic character, and he stands by what he says, just like Black Adam. Hey, listen, you know, you guys do whatever you want, but I actually know how to freaking run my country and whatnot. And in Latveria, like there's virtually no crime, there's little to no poverty and whatnot, and he takes care of his people. And woe be unto you if you freaking try Latveria, because he will freaking do whatever he wants, to protect his people. And that's the really important thing about this is that Injustice really just solidified, like popular characters, super popular characters, into these kinds of positions. Whereas we've had people like Black Adam and Doctor Doom that have always just been like, hey, listen, the only way that you're going to stop crime is when you take a very heavy-handed approach to it. It doesn't necessarily always have to be, militaristic in nature. It's just like, listen, you try that crap over here, and I'll have your head. That's basically what it is at the end of the day. And sadly, to say the least, no matter how many people like talk about injustice in the kind of natures about like whose side it's on, again, it's not about Batman or Superman. It's about human nature and the fact that, okay, should you have the freedom, you know even if you call it freedom, to start affecting someone else's freedom? If that's the case, then why do we all complain about like governments being crappy and whatnot? That person is sitting in like that position of excuse me, stuttering. That person sitting in position of power is basically just using their freedom to subjugate other people. Why are you even complaining at that point? Well, now it's me. Well, that's the point. You can't have absolute freedom and then expect there not to be douchebags that manipulate other people using their freedom. So at that point, one does beg the question: well, should you mitigate freedom from other people if that means that stops self-destructive tendencies? And as far as I'm concerned, I argue that yes, that's basically the only way that you pretty much have self-destructive tendencies stop is when you mitigate certain freedoms and whatnot. And I feel like the best answer to this overall, to be honest, indirectly, is kind of like someone like Darkseid, if you will, because Darkseid's goal is to find the anti-life equation. And basically, the anti-life equation basically completely allows you to subjugate people. But realistically, if Darkseid wasn't the one in control of it, and if it was say someone like who just basically said, "All right, you now no longer have the ability to like just murder someone." If you literally said that using the anti-life equation, that just happens. People literally just could not murder each other at any point. And again, it's all life. It's not just necessarily like just something limited to like a planet or something. You could literally just say no one can ever murder again, and bam, no one can murder again. It's so unfortunately, it seems like, realistically speaking, the only way that you'd ever really have that kind of ideal world that people are thinking about, oh, like one day, just one day, people will get it better. Like I'll keep talking about the problems, but I'm sure one day it'll get better. The only real way it'll happen is if some freedoms are unfortunately mitigated. But at that point, one does beg the question: well, did you really deserve it if that's what you intended to do with it for forever? Because it's one thing to just see the problems, it's one thing to talk about the problems, but then it's like, okay, well, someone needs to do something. All right, well, I've done my part. I talked. Like that was so difficult, especially in today's day and age. Like that was so difficult. Nah, man. Like it's really interesting. So unfortunately, I feel like that was what's missing from the movie. It just really didn't discuss the whole kind of like human nature side of things. It like that little conversation that they had in the movie, like where Superman just said like good, and he just said it like so casual. He's just like good. They should be scared. In comparison to the comics, like it's night and day. Like they went back at it. Like Superman was freaking losing it on Bruce. He was losing it on Bruce because of like how freaking infuriated he was. Because it was just hilarious, like looking at like the kind of backpedalings that Batman was taking when his whole shindig is fear to control criminals. So it was really interesting, and I highly recommend it. Like if you guys have somehow not read Injustice, or at least like watched a comic channel like cover it, please do yourself a favor and freaking watch it. It is amazing, right? It's one of the best stories to me that has ever been written in comics. So I'm just really sad that unfortunately wasn't really talked about in the films much. So I honestly feel like that's one of DC's weaker films. So I really hope that if they were to make, I don't know, like an Injustice 2 movie, that they really don't take that approach. But overall, like just rather them just like write something else, or if that's the case, or really just like cover some new story. Honestly, I wouldn't mind seeing like a Red Lantern movie or something. That'd be pretty cool. Or a Yellow Lantern movie for that matter. Like we need a good Green Lantern movie in general.